In this video on Lightroom, we're going to deal with global adjustments. We're going to change the white balance, adjust the overall exposure, and deal with any problems, whether highlights, shadows, blacks, or whites in the image. We're going to adjust that for the entire image. Okay, and for this point, we're going to go ahead and work on individual images one at a time. In a later video, I'll show you how to synchronize all those settings for multiple images if they were shot under similar lighting conditions. Just to start out with, let's go ahead and open up our catalog. Now, if you just launch Lightroom from your computer, it'll open up the last catalog you chose. So you won't have to go through this process, but I want to show you these little steps here. Okay, so here's where we left off. We have all the photographs here, but remember we created a selects collection, and let's jump right down to that. Go to the selects here, and now our collection, our selects collection, shows only the images that we feel like we need or want to work on, and that way we're not editing every single image in our catalog. And so from this point, we're in the library view, so it kind of shows us what images we have. Now what I'm going to do is click over to the develop module. Clicking on that, you'll see some changes to the interface. The first image comes full screen here. You can see our thumbnails at the bottom. You can click on any one of them to bring it forward. I'm going to start out with this one on the left. And let's take a look at some things here on the right-hand side. We have our different edit options or develop options here. At the top, we have our histogram. So we have our blacks, shadows, exposure, which is also similar to the midtones, highlights, and the white points in our image. This is shadow clipping, and this is highlight clipping. And what that means is if you have areas that are going completely black without detail or completely white without detail, these will show us visibly on our image that we have those issues. The idea with having areas that are black and white, you still want some detail. Otherwise, it's going to be a big black hole or a big white hole, and there's no detail. Even in those black areas, you still want some texture in most cases. Okay, some things it's not critical, but you definitely want to have probably some kind of texture in the black or shadow end, as well as the white or highlight end. Just quickly before we get into the adjustments, let me just show you what that looks like. So if I push the whites all the way over here, okay, notice how on my histogram it piles up on the right-hand side. On my image, it's showing me these areas have gone, it makes it red, but basically that's telling me those highlight areas are white without detail. If I uncheck this warning, it may look okay here, but in print, it may look too odd, too blotchy, okay? So keep in mind that you might be pushing that too far. If I go on the left-hand side and bring the shadows down, or the black point, again, it's piling up here, and this red shows me that I've got clipping in the black areas. So I'm gonna undo those, so that way we're kind of back to where we started from. And the first thing I want to do, it doesn't have to be the first thing, but one of the first things I want to do is click on lens correction. I'm going to click on this and this. And so if you have lens information as part of your raw file, 99% of the time, Lightroom will be able to pick it up and tell you what camera and make and model of the lens it is. So you can either remove some distortion or let the software deal with that. So if I uncheck this, notice how it kind of just bulges out just a little bit and gets a little bit lighter, just a little bit. It's correcting for that lens. And so I'm going to use my arrow keys. Well, I'll come back to that. We can do that for each one. Lens correction, and then the next one is the basic tab. If it's not already open, you can click this little triangle here. I'm not going to go through all these options here today, but we will deal with our global corrections using our basic edit options. Now, we talked about white balance, and we talked about setting our white balance. And so we can use as shot, auto, which gives its best guess. If we think we shot it in daylight and our camera was set to daylight, or it was shot in daylight and our camera was set to something else, choose daylight. If it was shade, you can see how the color shifts just a little bit. Tungsten, it's going to shift a lot because tungsten light is typically kind of a yellow-orange. And tungsten is the household light bulbs that get hot. The ones that stay cool are the fluorescent bulbs, and a lot of them are daylight balanced, so it's really a non-issue. Fluorescent, same thing, but it's kind of that fluorescent that maybe gives a color cast. Now, if you dialed it in when you shot it and you've got it correct, awesome, you're set. If you have an area in your image that you know to be neutral, 100% you're sure that it's neutral, you can click this eyedropper here. Now, we'll get more into shooting with the gray card or the color checker and using that as our white balance target. But here on this white shirt, if I click this neutral area, it kind of shifts a little bit. So I'm going to do before and after. And it actually got a little bit warmer, meaning it got a little bit more to the yellow-red end of the color scale. We're going to talk more about color here in a future video. So for now, we can set it at that. It actually looks pretty good. Now we've set our white balance, and now what we want to do is adjust the tonal range on our image. And that goes from the overall exposure of the image, the contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, and so on. And so just keeping it simple, we don't have to belabor any of these points. Notice this also has an auto option. Okay, if I click on auto, it's going to give us the best guess for this image. Okay, so it did. It lightened certain things up, and you can see here it's created a little bit of a clipping area. Okay, now we can bring that back based on what our sliders are doing, or we can say, you know what, they're non-critical areas, I can leave them as is. Okay, I'm going to undo that, and we'll go ahead and make our own corrections. So first off, I'm going to set the exposure, and again, push it a little too far, and you can see what's going to happen. Again, if with the clipping warning, if I push it by 2 stops or 2 1/3 stops, as you can see here, that's way overexposed, and it doesn't really do well with the image. So the idea with this I mean the exposure slider, is to get the overall values close to where you want them to be as best as you can. Now we can push and pull the highlights and shadows as necessary. So if I push this, get the midtones here, and the highlights here are going too light, I can bring that back down to a manageable level. The shadow areas underneath her neck and down in here, I can either open that up and the background goes a little dark, or a little too light actually, or I can just kind of leave it just a little bit. Okay, so again, this is a global adjustment. These are global adjustments affecting the entire image. I do recommend, regardless of how often you've been using Lightroom or lack of, any of these, push the sliders to their limits so you get an idea of what they do. I bring the whites all the way down. Maybe that's where you want it. And so it's not where I want it for this image, but you never know. Or if I push it up this way, except for the clipping part, maybe it needs to go brighter than it does, darker. Okay, and that's affecting mainly the whites. Here, black's just the same. I'm going to bring the blacks down a little bit. I'm okay with getting a little clipping in her hair. That's fine. Maybe increase the exposure a little bit. So sometimes there's a little bit of give and take. You go one direction one way, go one direction the other way, and maybe back and forth. Okay, so here we've made our adjustments. Sometimes it's a little difficult to see, what it looked like before. You don't want to have to strip off these adjustments just so you can see what it looked like before. So down at the bottom here, we have a before and after. You can do left and right. I like the before, after, left, right split. Okay, so here, even if I zoom in on my image, you can see what we started with and what we ended up with. Okay, so I'm not sure how this is going to translate in video, but on my image, it looks much better on the right-hand side or the after side. Here, it looks a little on the blue side, a little bit too magenta, you know, and so this looks a little bit more natural, a little bit more neutral on that side. So you can actually go in and see the before and after of what you want and make decisions from there. You can still, I'm sorry, you can shift that too horizontally if you want. I did that inadvertently. Get off of there. There it is. That's not it. Left and right. Boom. Okay, but let's say you did have these side by side. You can actually still go in, you know, and adjust the color tint or any of these other items. You know, if you wanted to play with the exposure, you can still do that. Now, I think I made that a little too, sorry for the unnecessary zoom. You know, I think I made that a little too warm. You know, when I shift it this way, it's getting warmer. When I shift it this way, it's getting cooler. So it all depends on the mood of the image you're trying to convey. But I'm going to go ahead and undo that. Just hit Command Z or Control Z on the PC, or you can just do undo, and you can just step backwards and step forward again. Okay, so those are huge time savers, knowing those shortcuts, because if you do a Command Z or Control Z, you can actually undo something quickly without having to think about where it is under the menu at the top of the screen. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off, the preview left and right. Dunk. There, click on that right there on the left-hand side, brings our image back. Again, we were talking about certain areas of our image, being blown out, which means too bright, or blocked up, which means too dark. One of the other things we want to make sure we have is critical focus. And so we can click on this and zoom in. Sometimes you have to give it a second for it to resolve, but basically we want to make sure that what we need in focus is in focus. Okay, and the chain looks nice and focused. Cool. So from here, our first image is done. You'll repeat that whole process for subsequent images. So for here, these images here, and so on, you're going to have different white balance requirements and settings. So, we can scroll down to lens correction, just quickly turn that on, and go back up here. Let's click auto. Let's see what it does. Whoa, a little too much on auto. Sometimes it gives you a good starting point though. And so from here, what we can do is dial back certain things. The things that I'm liking on this are the detail in her hair and kind of the overall values in her skin. Click on here to check critical focus. It resolves itself and shows me that this is definitely nice and crisp and clean. So perfect. So in this case, what I can do is maybe dial the blacks back, because I know that black area, and maybe open up the shadows a little bit. Okay, and so maybe the whites are a little too much. No, not too bad. I'm getting this weirdness going on here, the color-wise, but you can go in and really dial certain things in place. Now, some of this stuff up in the back here, we'll go ahead and deal with when we're making local adjustments, but for now, we'll just keep it as is. All right, so I'm not really digging that. That's better. Let's leave it like that for now. Here, same deal. Lens correction, bink, bink, boink. And sound effects are optional. It's up to you. Here, what I want to do is we're going to change the white balance. Let's say on one of these pearls. We know that's going to be neutral. If it's solid white, it might not pick it. See? So you can tell it's solid white because there's no detail. But if I picked it right off to the side of that, super duper subtle, but it works. If I picked on a non-neutral source, and this is a little fun little thing, you can see in the preview on the left hand up here, when I roll over it, how it's changing, but if I clicked on it, it's actually going to shift the white balance of my image in a very not good way. That's a technical term. Okay, so here what I want to do is I'm going to open up the exposure just a little bit. Now, as you can see, making some of these changes, it really will benefit you to actually get the exposure as close to perfect as possible initially. You don't want to have to like mess around with a lot of these settings. You're just going to fine-tune things using these settings. Highlights I think are in a good spot. Shadows, let's see what happens there. So shadows, it's opening them up a bit, and that's kind of nice. The black areas, again, push it a little too far if you need to, just to see what it's going to do. And the whites, too much. Too many whites there in the hot spots and so on. Now, we talked about the clipping. You can see here by turning the clipping back on, you get those little red specks in there. Certain things like specular highlights, these are a direct reflection from the light source, as this is. That's okay. You don't have to get everything so it has detail and texture. The critical areas of shadows and highlights, you do want to make sure that you have some kind of detail and texture to it. Okay, so again, some of these images we don't need to go through at the moment, but we'll leave off with this, that you're going to make adjustments using your lens correction as well as your basic adjustment tab here, and you're going to apply those adjustments overall to the image. The last thing I want to cover for this video is, sorry, I keep zooming in into that area. I apologize. Here, what we want to do is actually go in and maybe play with the clarity, vibrance, and saturation. Okay, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So clarity, let's zoom in on this. Clarity, what that does is kind of gives you edge contrast around areas of your image. What does that mean? I don't know. No, what it means is it actually, notice how the lights get lighter and the darks get darker. Okay, it's a little different than the other contrast up here. This contrast is kind of affecting the image overall. This clarity kind of does a similar effect, except it goes in and deals with the colors. You can see how it shifts. Now, if I take it to the negative all the way down, you can see how things kind of get soft and kind of watercolory. Now, if that's the effect you're going for, awesome. But if it's not, you want just a little pop or a little punch to the image, you can increase the clarity just a bit. Vibrance is going to intensify colors, but keep them in kind of a natural state. Here, if I take it down, it's going to kind of mute the colors. They're kind of still there, even though it doesn't quite look like it, but they're still kind of there. So if something's a little too bright, color-wise, you can actually take the vibrance down. Now, saturation, that can push it over the top. She kind of looks like now she's from the Jersey Shore. And so, or if I take saturation all the way down to the negative, it makes it more grayscale appearing. This is not a technique to make a grayscale image. We will be making grayscale images in this class, so don't go in and just desaturate the image for grayscale. There's way better ways to do that. Okay, so I'm going to undo some of that stuff, and boom, I think we're good. So at this point, I think we're good with making our global adjustments to our images and leaving it at that. In the next video, we'll go in and show you with some of these other images how to make local adjustments to fine-tune things even further. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video.